Hey everyone, hope you're doing well, and I'm so glad you've decided to join us again. Tonight, we are exploring what dating was like in the Renaissance court. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy our nighttime stories. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now it's time to dim the lights and relax as we start our story. In the grand courts of Renaissance Europe, where tapestries hung heavy with gold thread and the scent of beeswax candles mingled with rosewater, sprinkled on rushes beneath dancing slippers, the delicate art of courtship unfolded according to patterns as intricate as the lacework adorning a lady's sleeves. The process began not with stolen glances or whispered words, but with the careful examination of genealogical charts spread across oak tables in chambers, lit by diamond-paned windows, where fathers and their advisors traced bloodlines with ink-stained fingers, following the branching paths of noble families across parchment that crackled softly under their touch. The initial negotiations required the services of professional matchmakers, men of letters who maintained detailed records in leather-bound ledgers, each page numbered and indexed according to systems they had perfected over decades of service to noble houses. These intermediaries carried letters written on vellum with quills cut from swan feathers, the ink mixed fresh each morning from oak, gall and iron, creating words that dried to a deep brown that would not fade with time. They travelled between estates on horseback, their saddlebags protected by oiled leather covers, carrying documents sealed with wax impressed with signet rings that bore the heraldic devices of great families. When a potential match showed promise, the formal process of introduction began with the preparation of portraits. Court painters mixed their pigments with patience that matched the slow pace of courtship itself, grinding lapis lazuli for the deep blues of silk gowns, mixing vermilion with white lead for the pale complexions that marked nobility, adding tiny details with brushes made from single hairs plucked from the tails of sable. These portraits travelled in wooden boxes lined with silk, cushioned against the jolting of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets, accompanied by written descriptions of the subject's accomplishments, recorded in careful script by clerks who had learned their letters in monastery schools. The first meetings between potential couples occurred during carefully orchestrated court functions, where the placement of each individual had been determined through consultations that could last for hours. The master of ceremonies consulted charts that showed the relative rank of every attendee, ensuring that no slight would occur through improper seating arrangements at the long tables draped with linen cloths embroidered with heraldic designs. Servants polished silver plate with chamois leather until it gleamed in the candle light, arranged according to patterns established by tradition, and modified only after lengthy discussions among the household staff. During these gatherings, conversation between unmarried individuals followed scripts as formal as diplomatic negotiations. Young women learned appropriate responses from tutors who had served in multiple courts, memorizing phrases in Latin, French and Italian that demonstrated their education while revealing nothing of their personal thoughts or feelings. The topics deemed suitable for discussion included astronomy, where they might reference the movements of planets as calculated by court mathematicians, literature, where they could quote verses from Petrarch or demonstrate their familiarity with classical texts, and music, where knowledge of new compositions written for lute or virginals showed cultivation without impropriety. The physical aspects of these encounters were governed by regulations as detailed as those governing trade guilds. The distance maintained between speakers was measured not in feet, but in the length of a man's arm extended, with variations permitted based on the relative social standing of the participants. Touching was restricted to the brief contact of fingertips during formal dances, choreographed movements that had been practiced for hours under the supervision of dancing masters who corrected posture with gentle taps of ivory-tipped rods. Letters exchanged between courting couples required approval from multiple authorities before delivery. Each missive was first composed in draft form, written on paper made from linen rags that had been pulped and pressed into sheets, then dried on wooden frames. The initial version was reviewed by the writer's chaplain or tutor, who examined not only the content but the handwriting itself, ensuring that the script demonstrated proper education through its adherence to the formal styles taught in cathedral schools. Corrections were made with a knife that scraped away errors, leaving the paper slightly thinner where words had been changed. Once approved, the letter was recopied onto finer paper, often imported from Italian mills known for their quality, using ink mixed with recipes passed down through generations of scribes. The finished letter was folded according to specific patterns that indicated its level of formality, secured with silk ribbons in colors that held meaning within the complex language of courtly symbolism. Red indicated passion carefully contained within proper bounds, blue suggested constancy and virtue, while green spoke of hope for future happiness sanctioned by family approval. The delivery of these letters required the services of pages whose discretion had been tested through years of smaller commissions. These young men, usually the younger sons of minor nobility, carried the sealed messages in leather pouches worn close to their bodies, protecting the contents from rain with oiled coverings, and from theft through routes planned to avoid areas where bandits might waylay travelers carrying items of value. Gift-giving between couples followed elaborate protocols established through centuries of courtly tradition. The selection of appropriate presents required consultation with merchants who specialized in items suitable for romantic exchange while remaining within the bounds of propriety. Jewelry was crafted by goldsmiths who worked from designs approved by family counselors, creating pieces that displayed wealth and taste without suggesting improper intimacy. Rings carried messages spelled out in the arrangement of gems, where diamonds indicated steadfastness, emeralds suggested growth in affection, and sapphires spoke of faithfulness that would endure beyond the marriage ceremony. Books given as courtship gifts were chosen with particular care, selected from works deemed appropriate for unmarried women, while demonstrating the giver's education and sensitivity. Volumes of poetry were acceptable if they focused on themes of virtue and spiritual love rather than earthly passion, while books of hours, with their illuminated margins depicting saints and biblical scenes, showed proper religious devotion. Each book was bound in leather tooled with decorative patterns, the pages edged with gold leaf applied by craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeships lasting 7 years. The progression from acquaintance to formal engagement followed stages as clearly defined as the ranks of nobility themselves. Initial interest, expressed through the exchange of small tokens such as gloves embroidered with silk thread or handkerchiefs edged with lace made by nuns in distant convents, gave way to more serious courtship marked by the presentation of miniature portraits painted on ivory, by artists who specialized in these intimate likenesses. Music played a crucial role in courtship, with couples expected to demonstrate their harmony through duets performed on instruments whose tuning required careful attention to mathematical ratios discovered by ancient Greek philosophers. Lutes were strung with gut from sheep that had grazed on specific hillsides known for producing the clearest tones, while virginals were crafted from wood seasoned for decades before construction. The music itself was composed according to rules that governed the relationship between melody and harmony, creating sounds that pleased the ear without exciting emotions beyond what was considered appropriate for unmarried individuals. Dancing provided one of the few opportunities for physical proximity between courting couples, but even these movements were regulated by customs that specified the acceptable distance between partners and the duration of any contact between their hands. The steps themselves told stories of courtship through symbolic movements where advances and retreats mirrored the careful approach that characterized proper romantic pursuit. Dance masters spent months teaching these patterns to young nobles, correcting their posture with gentle adjustments and explaining the meaning behind each gesture. The clothing worn during courtship followed rules as complex as those governing diplomatic dress. Colors carried specific meanings that varied by season and occasion, with subtle variations in shade indicating different stages of romantic attachment. Fabrics were chosen not only for their beauty, but for their symbolic significance, with silk representing luxury earned through virtue, velvet suggesting depth of character, and linen indicating the purity of intention expected in all romantic dealings. Jewelry worn during courtship served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. Rings were positioned on specific fingers to indicate the wearer's availability and intentions, while necklaces displayed gems chosen for their supposed influence on the emotions. Pearls were believed to encourage chastity and wisdom, while garnets were thought to inspire constancy and affection. The settings for these stones were crafted by jewelers who understood not only the technical aspects of metalworking, but the symbolic language that guided their creation. The progression toward marriage required the involvement of numerous specialists whose expertise ensured that no detail would be overlooked in the complex negotiations that preceded any formal betrothal. Lawyers examined property records that had been maintained for generations, tracing the ownership of lands and goods through documents written in Latin on parchment that bore the seals of long-dead notaries. Financial advisors calculated dowries and jointures according to formulas that took into account not only current assets but projected income from estates that might not reach full productivity for decades to come. Medical examinations were conducted by physicians who had studied at universities where ancient texts were copied by hand onto vellum pages, preserving knowledge that had been passed down through centuries of scholarly tradition. These doctors examined potential brides and grooms according to theories that linked physical health to spiritual virtue, checking for signs that might indicate future problems with fertility or the ability to produce healthy heirs. The formal announcement of an engagement required the preparation of documents that would be copied multiple times and distributed to relatives whose approval was necessary for the match to proceed. These announcements were written by professional scribes who specialized in the formal language required for such occasions, using phrases that had been refined through generations of similar documents. The paper used for these copies was often specially made for the occasion, with watermarks that identified the families involved and served as protection against forgery. Preparations for the wedding itself began months before the ceremony, with seamstresses working by candlelight to create gowns whose every detail had been specified by tradition and modified slightly to reflect the taste of the current generation. The silk for these garments came from merchants who had traveled overland from the Orient, carrying their precious cargo in caravans that faced dangers from weather bandits and the simple wear of long travel over rough roads. The food served at wedding celebrations required the coordination of cooks who had trained under masters whose recipes had been perfected through decades of service to noble households. Spices were purchased from traders who dealt in goods so valuable that they were weighed on scales accurate to fractions of ounces, their worth calculated according to exchange rates that fluctuated with the seasons and the success or failure of trading expeditions that might take years to complete. Musicians prepared for wedding entertainments by practicing compositions that combined traditional melodies with new arrangements created specifically for the occasion. These pieces were written down in notation systems that had been developed by monks who understood music as a reflection of divine harmony, using symbols that indicated not only which notes to play, but how they should be ornamented and phrased to create the desired emotional effect. The guest lists for wedding celebrations were compiled through consultations that involved not only the families directly concerned but their advisors, who understood the complex web of alliances and rivalries that could be affected by the inclusion or exclusion of particular individuals. Invitations were written by hand on paper selected for its quality and appearance, each one carefully phrased to indicate the precise level of honor being extended to the recipient. Servants prepared for wedding celebrations by learning new routines for serving the elaborate meals that such occasions demanded. Table linens were washed in water drawn from wells known for their purity, dried on lines strung between trees in gardens where the air was sweetened by herbs planted specifically for their fragrance. Silver and gold plate was polished with cloths that had been treated with preparations designed to bring out the highest possible shine without damaging the precious metals. The ceremony itself took place according to rituals that had been refined through centuries of practice, with every word and gesture carrying significance that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Priests prepared by fasting and prayer, ensuring that they would be spiritually ready to perform a sacrament that would bind two souls together not only for their earthly lives but for eternity. The words they spoke had been preserved in books copied by scribes who understood their sacred nature, written in scripts that reflected the solemnity of the occasion. Wedding rings were crafted by goldsmiths who worked with metals refined through processes that had been perfected over generations of practice. The gold was heated in furnaces built according to designs that maximized the temperature while minimizing the fuel required, allowing the craftsman to work the precious metal into forms that would endure for lifetimes. The inscriptions carved inside these rings were chosen from phrases that had been used for similar purposes throughout the history of Christian marriage, words that connected each new couple to the long tradition of matrimonial union. The flowers used in wedding decorations were chosen not only for their beauty but for their symbolic meanings, with roses representing love sanctified by divine blessing, lilies indicating purity of intention, and rosemary suggesting remembrance of vows made before witnesses both earthly and heavenly. These flowers were arranged by specialists who had learned their craft through apprenticeships that taught them not only the technical aspects of their work but the deeper meanings that gave their creations significance beyond mere decoration. The documentation of marriages required the services of clerks who maintained records that would preserve the details of each union for future generations. These documents were written on parchment that had been prepared according to methods that ensured its durability, using inks mixed from recipes that would resist fading even after centuries of storage. The writing itself followed formal patterns that made the information easy to retrieve when needed for legal purposes or genealogical research. The establishment of new households after marriage involved the coordination of craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through guild systems that maintained standards of quality through regulations enforced by masters who had achieved their positions through years of demonstrated excellence. Carpenters created furniture according to designs that balanced functionality with beauty, using woods that had been seasoned through processes that could take decades to complete. The training of servants for these new households required the expertise of stewards who understood not only the practical aspects of household management but the social distinctions that governed interactions between masters and those who served them. New servants learned their duties through observation and practice, gradually developing the skills that would allow them to perform their tasks with the discretion and efficiency that noble households demanded. The establishment of gardens around newly built homes followed principles that had been developed through centuries of experimentation with different combinations of plants and growing techniques. Seeds were selected from varieties that had proven their worth through generations of cultivation, stored in containers that protected them from moisture and pests while preserving their ability to germinate when the proper season arrived. The creation of libraries for educated couples involved the acquisition of books that had been copied by scribes working in scriptoriums where silence was maintained to ensure accuracy in transcription. Each volume represented months or years of careful work, with letters formed according to standards that made the text both beautiful and legible. The bindings for these books were crafted from leather that had been treated with processes that would protect the pages within from damage caused by time and handling. The daily routines of married couples in Renaissance courts followed patterns that had been established through generations of custom and refined through the experience of countless households. Morning prayers were said according to texts that had been selected for their appropriateness to married life, while evening devotions included special petitions for the blessing of children and the prosperity of the family line. Meals were served according to schedules that took into account not only the nutritional needs of the household but the social obligations that required certain foods to be available for unexpected guests. The preparation of these meals involved the coordination of kitchen staff who had learned their skills through apprenticeships that taught them not only cooking techniques but the etiquette that governed the service of food to people of different social ranks. The clothing worn by married couples reflected their new status through subtle changes in style and ornamentation that indicated their transition from single to married life. These garments were created by tailors and seamstresses who understood the symbolic language of dress, using fabrics and decorations that proclaimed the wearer's position in society, while conforming to the expectations that governed appropriate appearance for married individuals. The management of household finances required careful attention to records that tracked income and expenses according to systems that had been developed to ensure accuracy, while providing the information needed for planning future expenditures. These accounts were maintained by clerks who had been trained in mathematical techniques that allowed them to perform complex calculations without the mechanical aids that would become available in later centuries. The education of children born to these marriages followed curricula that had been designed to prepare them for their eventual roles in adult society. Boys learned Latin grammar from texts that had been copied by hand, while girls studied needlework patterns that would allow them to create the decorative items expected in well-appointed homes. Music lessons used instruments that had been crafted according to traditional designs, with instruction that emphasized not only technical skill but the proper deportment expected when performing for others.
The seasonal celebrations that mark the passage of time in Renaissance courts provide opportunities for married couples to demonstrate their prosperity and social position through entertainments that followed established customs while allowing for small innovations that reflected contemporary taste. These festivities required months of preparation, with servants working to create decorations that would impress guests while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their master's rank. The correspondence maintained by married couples with relatives and friends followed formats that had been established through generations of letter writing, using phrases that conveyed information while observing the courtesies that social rank demanded. These letters were written on paper that had been selected for its quality, with quills that had been cut and prepared according to techniques that ensured smooth writing and clear script. The charitable activities that were expected of noble couples required careful planning to ensure that their gifts would be distributed in ways that reflected well on their generosity, while helping those who were genuinely in need. These efforts involved the coordination of servants who understood the discretion required when dealing with sensitive matters of poverty and social distress. The maintenance of family records required the services of genealogists who had trained in the complex rules that governed the inheritance of titles and property. These specialists maintained charts that traced family connections through generations, using symbols and notation systems that preserved crucial information in forms that could be consulted when questions arose about succession or marriage eligibility. The planning of pilgrimages and other religious journeys involved consultations with priests who understood not only the spiritual significance of such undertakings, but the practical requirements for travel that might last for months and cover hundreds of miles. These trips required careful preparation of supplies and equipment, with attention to details that would ensure the safety and comfort of the travelers while maintaining the devotional atmosphere appropriate to religious pilgrimage. The creation of wills and other legal documents required the expertise of lawyers who had studied both civil and canon law, understanding the complex relationships between secular and religious authority that governed the disposal of property and the guardianship of minor children. These documents were written according to formulas that had been tested through centuries of legal practice, using language that would be understood by future courts while clearly expressing the intentions of their creators. The daily prayers and devotions that structured the spiritual life of married couples followed patterns that had been established by religious authorities who understood the special obligations and opportunities that came with matrimony. These observances included special petitions for family members and requests for divine guidance in the raising of children and management of household affairs. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in Renaissance courts created opportunities for couples to participate in activities that strengthened their bonds while fulfilling their social obligations. Spring brought preparations for planting in household gardens. Summer provided occasions for entertaining guests in outdoor settings. Autumn marked the time for preserving foods that would sustain the household through winter. And winter offered opportunities for indoor pursuits that brought family members together around fires that provided both warmth and light for evening activities.
Why one man catalogued 2,000 leaves and never explained why. In the autumn of 1847, Theodore Whitmore began what would become the most methodical and unexplained botanical undertaking of his generation. Working from a small study in his stone cottage outside Bath, England, he initiated a process of leaf collection and documentation that would consume the remaining 37 years of his life, producing detailed records of 2,014 individual leaves, each one pressed, measured, drawn, and described with a precision that bordered on obsession. Yet never once did he commit to paper any explanation for why this work mattered to him, or what larger purpose it might serve. The first leaf entered his collection on October 15th, a common oak specimen that he discovered on his morning walk along the lane that connected his property to the village proper. He recorded the time of discovery as 8:30 in the morning, the weather conditions as overcast with a light mist, and the exact location as 7 paces beyond the stone marker that indicated the boundary of the Pemberton estate. The leaf itself measured 4 3/4 inches in length, with a width of 3 inches at its broadest point, displaying the characteristic lobed pattern of Quercus robur, though Whitmore's notes described it simply as leaf number 1, oak variety, moderate size, autumn coloration beginning at edges. His method of preservation required materials that he ordered from suppliers in London, writing careful letters that specified the exact type of pressing paper he required, the weight and texture that would best serve his purposes without damaging the delicate structures he sought to preserve. The paper arrived in parcels wrapped in brown cloth, each sheet cut to uniform dimensions that he had calculated, would provide adequate space for specimens while allowing for the detailed annotations that would accompany each entry in his growing catalogue. The pressing process itself followed a routine that Whitmore refined through the first months of his work, adjusting the pressure and timing based on observations he recorded in a separate notebook dedicated to methodological notes. He placed each leaf between sheets of the specialized paper, positioning it with tweezers that he had purchased from a surgical instrument maker, ensuring that every part of the specimen lay flat without folding or overlapping. The weighted press that he used for this work had been constructed by a local carpenter, according to specifications that Whitmore had drawn himself, creating a device that applied uniform pressure across the entire surface of the pressing chamber. Each leaf remained in the press for exactly 14 days, a duration that Whitmore had determined through experimentation with his earliest specimens, testing different periods to find the optimal balance between thorough drying and preservation of color and form. He marked the date of pressing and the scheduled date of removal on small cards that he filed in a wooden box, checking these reminders each morning as part of a routine that began before dawn and continued methodically through the daylight hours. The catalogue itself was maintained in a series of leather-bound ledgers that Whitmore commissioned from a bookbinder in Bath, specifying the paper quality, the ruling pattern, and the binding style that would best serve his long-term documentation needs. Each entry occupied a full page, with space allocated for measurements, sketches, written descriptions and a small area where the pressed leaf would eventually be mounted using a paste that he mixed himself from flour and water, adding a small amount of alum to prevent deterioration. His measuring tools included a set of calipers accurate to 1/16 of an inch, a ruler marked in both English and metric units, and a collection of geometric instruments that allowed him to calculate angles and proportions with mathematical precision. Each leaf was measured in multiple dimensions, with lengths recorded for the overall specimen, the stem and each major vein that contributed to the leaf structure. Widths were noted at the broadest point and at regular intervals along the length, creating a numerical profile that captured the precise proportions of every specimen. The drawings that accompanied each catalogue entry were executed with pen and ink, using techniques that Whitmore had taught himself through careful study of botanical illustration manuals that he borrowed from the library of a naturalist society in Bath. He developed his own system of hatching and cross-hatching to indicate different textures and colorations, practicing these techniques on separate sheets of paper until he could reproduce the subtle variations that distinguished one leaf from another. Winter presented challenges that required Whitmore to modify his collection methods, as the leaves available during the colder months were primarily those that had been preserved on evergreen trees, or had fallen and been protected under layers of snow. He developed techniques for cleaning these specimens, removing dirt and debris with soft brushes while preserving the natural oils and waxy coatings that gave each leaf its characteristic appearance and texture. His walks in search of specimens followed routes that he planned each evening, consulting maps that he had annotated with notes about previous discoveries and areas that might yield new varieties. These maps were drawn on heavy paper that he protected in a leather portfolio, marking locations with symbols that indicated the types of trees present and the seasons when they were most likely to produce interesting specimens. The second year of his work brought refinements to his documentation system, as Whitmore recognized patterns in his data that suggested new categories of analysis. He began recording the specific conditions under which each leaf had grown, noting factors such as soil composition, exposure to sunlight, proximity to water sources, and evidence of insect damage or disease. These observations required additional research into the history and management of the properties where he collected specimens, leading him to develop relationships with local landowners who granted him permission to explore their grounds. His correspondence with these property owners was conducted with the same methodical approach that characterized all aspects of his work. He wrote formal letters requesting permission to collect botanical specimens, explaining his methods without revealing his ultimate purposes, describing the care he took to avoid damaging trees or disturbing cultivation. The responses he received were filed in a separate collection, organized by date and cross-referenced with maps that showed the locations where he had been granted access. Spring brought new opportunities and challenges as the rapid growth of fresh leaves required Whitmore to adjust his collection schedule to capture specimens at different stages of development. He began maintaining charts that tracked the emergence of new growth on trees he had identified during previous seasons, visiting these locations at regular intervals to document the progression from bud to fully developed leaf. His storage system expanded as the collection grew, requiring the construction of additional shelving and the development of new organizational methods that would allow him to locate specific specimens without disrupting the careful arrangement of his catalog. He designed custom boxes that held the pressed leaves in protective sleeves, with each container labeled according to a coding system that indicated the date of collection, the type of tree, and the location where the specimen had been found. The third year brought the addition of chemical analysis to his documentation process, as Whitmore acquired the equipment and materials necessary to test the mineral content and acidity of his specimens. These tests required small samples to be removed from each leaf, a process that he performed with surgical precision to avoid damaging the integrity of the pressed specimens. The results of these analyses were recorded in separate columns in his ledgers, adding new dimensions to the data he maintained about each leaf. His laboratory equipment was housed in a room that he converted from a storage area, installing proper ventilation and lighting that would allow him to conduct his chemical tests safely and accurately. The chemicals required for these analyses were ordered from suppliers in London and Edinburgh, arriving in carefully labeled bottles that he stored according to safety procedures he had learned from chemistry texts borrowed from the university library. The methodical nature of his work attracted attention from other botanists and naturalists, who wrote letters inquiring about his research and requesting permission to visit his collection. Whitmore responded to these inquiries with polite but non-committal replies, welcoming visitors who wished to examine his specimens while carefully avoiding any discussion of his motivations or theoretical framework. These visits were scheduled during specific hours when he could provide proper supervision without disrupting his daily routine of collection and documentation. His reputation as a meticulous cataloger led to invitations to join scientific societies and contribute to botanical publications, opportunities that he declined without explanation, preferring to continue his work in isolation. The letters extending these invitations were preserved in his files, along with copies of his polite refusals, creating a record of the professional recognition that his work had attracted despite his reluctance to engage with the broader scientific community. The fourth year of his project coincided with changes in his personal circumstances that required him to hire assistance with the physical aspects of his work. He employed a local woman to help with the pressing and mounting of specimens, training her in his exact methods and supervising her work to ensure that it met his exacting standards. This collaboration was documented in notes that recorded the specific tasks assigned to his assistant and the quality standards that governed her contributions to the project. His financial records from this period show regular expenditures for materials and equipment, with careful accounting of costs that allowed him to budget for the long-term continuation of his work. These records were maintained with the same precision that characterized all aspects of his documentation, providing a detailed picture of the resources required to support his botanical research. The expansion of his collection required periodic reorganization of his storage and filing systems, processes that took several weeks to complete as he moved specimens to new locations while maintaining the integrity of his organizational scheme. These reorganizations were planned months in advance, with detailed schedules that ensured minimal disruption to his ongoing collection activities. His daily routine during these years followed a pattern that rarely varied, beginning before sunrise with the review of weather conditions and the planning of collection routes for the day. Breakfast was followed by several hours of fieldwork, then afternoon sessions devoted to processing new specimens and updating his catalog entries. Evenings were reserved for correspondence, equipment maintenance, and the preparation for the following day's activities. The seasonal changes that marked the passage of years in his work were documented with particular attention to the ways that climate variations affected the growth and development of the trees he monitored. Unusual weather patterns, drought conditions, and early or late seasonal changes were all noted in his records, along with observations about how these factors influenced the characteristics of the leaves he collected. His collection reached its first 1,000 specimens in the 6th year of the project, a milestone that he marked with a single line in his journal noting the date and the identity of the leaf that achieved this numerical significance. The 1,000th leaf was a specimen of English elm collected from a tree that stood in the churchyard of the village, a location that he had visited regularly but had not previously yielded any additions to his collection. The second 1,000 specimens accumulated more rapidly as Whitmore refined his collection methods and expanded his geographical range, traveling to neighboring counties to document leaves from trees that were not present in his immediate area. These trips were planned with military precision, with detailed itineraries that maximized his collection opportunities while minimizing travel time and expense. His travel equipment included portable pressing apparatus that he designed himself, allowing him to begin the preservation process immediately after collection rather than risking deterioration during transport back to his home laboratory. These portable presses were constructed by local craftsmen according to specifications that Whitmore had developed through experimentation with different designs and materials. The documentation of his travels included detailed maps showing his routes and stopping points, along with notes about local customs and regulations that might affect his collecting activities. He maintained correspondence with botanists and naturalists in the areas he visited, seeking recommendations for productive collecting sites and permissions to access private properties. His reputation as a serious researcher opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, as landowners and estate managers recognized the scholarly nature of his work even without understanding its ultimate purpose. These relationships were cultivated through careful correspondence and maintained through regular updates about his research progress and discoveries. The technical aspects of his documentation process continued to evolve as new materials and methods became available through scientific supply companies and equipment manufacturers. He tested new types of mounting adhesives, experimented with different preservation techniques, and upgraded his measuring instruments to maintain the highest possible standards of accuracy in his measurements and observations. His notebooks from the later years of the project show increasing complexity in the data he recorded about each specimen, with new categories of analysis added as he recognized patterns and relationships that had not been apparent in his earlier work. These additions required him to revisit his earlier specimens to collect additional data, a process that took several months to complete as he worked systematically through his collection. The scientific community's interest in his work continued to grow as word spread about the scale and precision of his documentation, leading to requests for access to his data from researchers working on related projects. Whitmore accommodated these requests when possible while maintaining his policy of not discussing his theoretical framework or ultimate objectives. His daily correspondence during these years included letters to suppliers of materials and equipment, requests for access to new collecting sites and responses to inquiries from other researchers. These letters were composed with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all aspects of his work, with copies preserved in files that provided a complete record of his professional communications. The physical demands of his fieldwork required him to maintain his health and fitness through regular exercise and careful attention to his diet, habits that he documented in journals that tracked his physical condition and its relationship to his ability to conduct his research effectively. These personal records were maintained with the same systematic approach that governed his botanical documentation. His equipment maintenance schedules ensured that his tools and instruments remained in optimal condition despite the heavy use they received during decades of intensive fieldwork. He developed relationships with craftsmen and repair specialists who understood the precision required for scientific work, maintaining these professional connections through regular correspondence and prompt payment for services rendered. The seasonal rhythms that governed his collecting activities required careful coordination with the natural cycles of tree growth and leaf development,
leading him to develop detailed calendars that predicted the optimal times for collecting different types of specimens in various locations. These calendars were updated annually, based on his observations of how climate variations affected the timing of natural processes. His library of reference materials grew steadily as he acquired books, journals, and scientific papers that might inform his work or provide context for his observations. These materials were organized according to classification systems that allowed him to locate specific information quickly when needed for his research or documentation activities. The preservation of his own records became an increasing concern as the project continued, leading him to develop backup systems that would protect his documentation from loss due to fire, flood, or other disasters. He began creating duplicate copies of his most important data, storing these backups in different locations to ensure the survival of his work regardless of what might happen to his primary files. His relationships with local communities evolved as residents became accustomed to seeing him during his regular collecting expeditions, with many people developing an understanding of his work even though they shared his ignorance about its ultimate purpose. Children in the villages he visited began bringing him unusual leaves they had found, contributions that he acknowledged with the same seriousness he applied to his own discoveries. The methodical approach that characterized every aspect of his work extended to his personal finances, which he managed with careful budgeting that ensured the continuation of his project regardless of economic fluctuations or unexpected expenses. His account books showed regular allocations for research materials with contingency funds set aside for equipment repairs and replacement costs. His health remained stable throughout most of the project period, though he began experiencing minor ailments that required adjustments to his fieldwork schedule and collecting methods. These changes were documented in his personal journals along with notes about how they affected his research productivity and the quality of his work. The final years of his life saw a gradual reduction in his collecting activities as his physical capabilities declined, though he continued to maintain his existing specimens and update his documentation until very near the end of his life. His last catalogue entry was made just 3 weeks before his death in 1884, recording details of a maple leaf that he had discovered during one of his final walks through the countryside that had provided him with decades of research material.
Why a 1901 schoolteacher saved every broken chalk piece. In the third-floor classroom of the Riverside Elementary School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Miss Eleanor Hartwell began what would become the most peculiar archival project in the history of American public education. Starting on the morning of September 3, 1901, she initiated a systematic collection of every piece of broken chalk that fell from her blackboard or crumbled beneath the pressure of her daily lessons, gathering these fragments with the same careful attention that a mineralogist might devote to precious specimens, though she never offered any explanation for this unusual practice to her colleagues, her students, or the curious school administrators who occasionally questioned the growing collection of small wooden boxes that lined the shelves of her otherwise orderly classroom. The first piece entered her collection during the second week of the school year, when a stick of white chalk snapped in half while she was writing the day's arithmetic problems on the blackboard that stretched across the front wall of her classroom. The chalk had been manufactured by the American Crayon Company of Sandusky, Ohio, and arrived at the school as part of a shipment of educational supplies that included slates, erasers, and the wooden-handled pointers that teachers used to direct students' attention to specific items on the board. Miss Hartwell had been writing the numeral 7 when the chalk broke, leaving her holding a piece approximately 2 inches long while the remaining fragment, measuring just over an inch, fell to the floor with a soft clicking sound that seemed to echo in the quiet classroom where 32 children sat watching her every movement. She completed the arithmetic lesson using the longer piece of chalk, but after dismissing the students for their midday recess, she retrieved the fallen fragment from where it had rolled beneath her desk. Rather than discarding it in the wastebasket that stood beside her chair, she examined the broken piece carefully, noting the clean break that revealed the chalk's internal structure, the way the compressed calcium carbonate had fractured along natural stress lines that had been created during the manufacturing process. The piece felt substantial despite its small size, with a density that spoke of the pressure that had been applied to form the original stick from powdered limestone and binding agents. Her method of storage began simply, with the first few pieces of broken chalk placed in an empty cigar box that she had obtained from Mr. Peterson, who operated the tobacco shop on 2nd Avenue. The box had originally contained Cuban cigars imported through New Orleans, and retained a faint aroma of tobacco leaves that seemed to complement the dusty mineral scent of the chalk fragments. She lined the box with cotton batting that she had purchased from the dry goods store, creating small compartments that would prevent the pieces from knocking against each other and breaking further during storage. Each piece was accompanied by a small card on which Miss Hartwell recorded the date of breakage, the subject being taught when the incident occurred, the approximate time of day, and a brief description of the circumstances that had led to the chalk's failure. These cards were written in her careful penmanship using a fountain pen filled with black ink, the same writing implement she used for preparing lesson plans and recording grades in the leather-bound grade book that she kept locked in the top drawer of her desk. The second piece joined the collection 3 days later, when a stick of yellow chalk crumbled while she was drawing a map of Iowa on the blackboard during the afternoon geography lesson. Yellow chalk was less common than white, ordered specifically for creating visual emphasis in diagrams and maps, and manufactured using different minerals that gave it both its distinctive color and a slightly different texture that made it more prone to breaking under pressure. The fragment that fell from this piece was smaller than the first, measuring less than 3/4 of an inch, but Miss Hartwell treated it with the same careful attention, creating a new index card and finding space for it in the growing collection. By October, the collection had grown to include 17 pieces, representing breaks from white, yellow, and blue chalk, with the blue specimens being the rarest since colored chalk was used sparingly due to its higher cost and limited availability from suppliers. Each color required different storage considerations, as Miss Hartwell discovered that some colored chalks were more susceptible to humidity changes that could cause additional cracking or color fading over time. She began experimenting with different methods of preservation, testing various types of cotton batting and investigating the use of small envelopes made from acid-free paper that she ordered from a stationery supplier in Chicago. Her classroom routine adapted to accommodate the collection process, with Miss Hartwell developing an almost supernatural awareness of when chalk was about to break. She could detect the subtle changes in resistance that preceded a fracture, the way the chalk would begin to feel different in her grip moments before it snapped under the pressure of writing. This sensitivity allowed her to position herself to catch falling fragments, preventing them from bouncing across the floor where they might break into even smaller pieces or become contaminated with dust and debris. The students in her classroom began to notice their teacher's unusual behavior, whispering among themselves about the way she would pause her lessons to retrieve fallen chalk pieces, examining each fragment before placing it carefully on her desk rather than throwing it away. Some of the older students, particularly those in the 6th grade who had developed a keen awareness of adult inconsistencies, began asking questions about why she kept the broken pieces, but Miss Hartwell deflected these inquiries with gentle redirections back to the lesson at hand. Winter brought new challenges to the collection process, as the dry air created by the coal stove that heated the classroom caused chalk to become more brittle and prone to breaking. The increased frequency of breakage meant that some days would yield 3 or 4 new pieces for the collection, requiring Miss Hartwell to expand her storage system beyond the original cigar box. She obtained additional containers from various sources around town, including wooden boxes that had held imported tea, small tins that had contained throat lozenges, and specially constructed wooden cases that she commissioned from Mr. Wilhelm, the German cabinet maker who operated a workshop on First Street. The documentation system evolved as the collection grew, with Miss Hartwell developing a more sophisticated indexing method that allowed her to track patterns in the breakage. She began noting the age of each stick of chalk when it broke, information she could determine by referencing the delivery records that she maintained for all classroom supplies. These records showed that chalk typically broke most frequently during its 2nd or 3rd week of use, after the initial hardness had been worn away by contact with the blackboard, but before it had become so worn that it would naturally be discarded. Her correspondence with chalk manufacturers began during the winter months, as Miss Hartwell wrote letters to the American Crayon Company and other suppliers requesting information about the composition and manufacturing processes used to create the chalk sticks she used in her classroom. These letters were models of professional inquiry, explaining her interest in understanding the materials she worked with daily without revealing the existence of her collection or her systematic documentation of breakage patterns. The responses she received provided technical information about the mixture of calcium carbonate, calcium sulfate, and binding agents used to create different types of chalk, along with details about the pressing and drying processes that determined the final density and durability of each stick. This information was carefully filed in a separate folder that she kept in her desk, cross-referenced with her collection records to provide context for the breakage patterns she was documenting. Spring cleaning in the classroom required careful planning to protect the growing collection from the disruption caused by the annual deep cleaning that the school district required at the end of each academic year. Miss Hartwell developed a system for temporarily relocating her collection to her boarding house room, where she could continue her documentation work during the summer months while the classroom was being painted and refurbished. The process of moving the collection required several trips, with each container carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent jostling that might cause additional breakage. The summer months provided an opportunity for Miss Hartwell to reorganize her collection according to new classification criteria that she had developed through her first year of systematic collection. She created separate categories based on the color of the chalk, the circumstances of breakage, the size of the resulting fragments, and the subject being taught when the break occurred. This reorganization revealed patterns that had not been apparent when the pieces were stored simply in chronological order of collection. Her boarding house room during the summer of 1902 resembled a small laboratory, with boxes of chalk fragments arranged on every available surface and index cards spread across the small writing desk where she normally prepared her lesson plans. Mrs. Kowalski, her landlady, expressed concern about the unusual collection but accepted Miss Hartwell's explanation that it was related to her teaching research without pressing for additional details. The beginning of the second school year brought refinements to both the collection and documentation processes, as Miss Hartwell implemented improvements based on her experience during the first year. She obtained a precision scale from a pharmaceutical supplier, allowing her to record the exact weight of each fragment along with its measurements. This additional data revealed relationships between the size and weight of broken pieces that provided insights into the density variations within individual sticks of chalk. Her classroom management skills evolved to incorporate the collection process seamlessly into her daily teaching routine. Students became accustomed to brief pauses in lessons while their teacher retrieved fallen chalk pieces, and some of the more observant children began alerting her to fragments that had fallen beyond her immediate notice. These spontaneous contributions to the collection process were acknowledged with the same careful documentation that Miss Hartwell applied to pieces she discovered herself. The second year also brought the first visit from a school district administrator, who had heard rumors about Miss Hartwell's unusual collecting habits. Superintendent Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, ostensibly to observe her teaching methods but clearly curious about the wooden boxes that were visible on shelves around the classroom. Miss Hartwell conducted a normal arithmetic lesson while he observed, making no reference to her collection despite breaking 2 pieces of chalk during the course of the demonstration. After the students were dismissed for recess, Superintendent Morrison inquired about the boxes, and Miss Hartwell provided a brief explanation that she was conducting research into the durability of classroom materials. This explanation satisfied the administrator's curiosity without revealing the full scope or nature of her documentation project, and he departed with compliments about her teaching effectiveness and classroom management skills. The collection continued to grow throughout the second year, with Miss Hartwell refining her storage methods to accommodate the increasing number of specimens. She began using standardized containers that could be stacked efficiently, with each box labeled according to a coding system that indicated the contents without revealing the nature of the collection to casual observers.
The codes used combinations of letters and numbers that appeared to reference curriculum materials, providing camouflage for the true contents of the containers. Her personal correspondence during this period included letters to former classmates from the teachers' college she had attended in Iowa City, sharing news about her teaching career without mentioning her collecting activities. These letters provide insight into her thinking about education and classroom management, revealing a thoughtful educator who was constantly seeking to improve her effectiveness as a teacher while pursuing her mysterious documentation project. The third year brought the addition of photographic documentation to her collection process, as Miss Hartwell acquired a small camera that allowed her to create visual records of particularly interesting fragments. The camera, a Kodak model designed for amateur photographers, required careful attention to lighting and exposure settings, skills that Miss Hartwell developed through experimentation and study of photography manuals borrowed from the public library. The photographs were developed in a makeshift darkroom that she created in the basement of her boarding house, with permission from Mrs. Kowalski and assistance from Mr. Hansen, a local photographer who provided advice about chemicals and processing techniques. These photographic records added a new dimension to her documentation, capturing details of fracture patterns and surface textures that were difficult to describe adequately in written notes. The process of photographing chalk fragments required specialized techniques due to their small size and pale colors, which tended to disappear against light backgrounds in standard photographic setups. Miss Hartwell experimented with different backgrounds and lighting arrangements, eventually developing a system that used dark cloth backgrounds and carefully positioned oil lamps to create the contrast needed for clear images. Her classroom teaching during the third year incorporated lessons about minerals and geology that drew upon knowledge she had gained through her research into chalk composition and manufacturing. These lessons were popular with students who enjoyed learning about the origins of the materials they used daily in their schoolwork. Miss Hartwell never directly mentioned her collection during these lessons, but her expertise in the subject matter was evident in the depth and accuracy of her explanations. The documentation system continued to evolve, with Miss Hartwell adding new categories of analysis based on patterns she had observed in her growing collection. She began tracking the relationship between weather conditions and breakage frequency, noting that chalk was more likely to break during periods of high humidity or rapid temperature changes. These observations led her to investigate the storage conditions in the school's supply closet, where she discovered that chalk shipments were sometimes exposed to moisture that affected their structural integrity. Her correspondence with school suppliers expanded during this period, as she began providing feedback about the quality and durability of different chalk brands and formulations. These letters, written in her capacity as an experienced teacher, were welcomed by suppliers who valued input from educators about the performance of their products in classroom settings. Miss Hartwell's reputation as a knowledgeable consumer of educational materials grew, leading to invitations to test new products and provide opinions about proposed improvements to existing ones. The fourth year of the collection coincided with changes in the school district's purchasing policies that affected the types and quality of chalk available for classroom use. Budget constraints led to the adoption of lower-cost chalk that proved to be more brittle and prone to breaking, resulting in a significant increase in the number of fragments added to Miss Hartwell's collection. This increase required expansion of her storage facilities, and prompted her to investigate more efficient methods of documentation that could handle the larger volume of specimens. Her relationship with the school janitor, Mr. O'Brien, evolved during this period as he became aware of her interest in retrieving chalk pieces that might otherwise be swept up and discarded during his cleaning routines. Without fully understanding her purposes, he began setting aside fragments that he found during his work, leaving them on her desk in small piles that she would sort and catalog the following morning. The systematic nature of her collection attracted attention from other teachers, who began asking questions about her research and expressing interest in contributing to her documentation efforts. Miss Hartwell welcomed these offers of assistance while carefully controlling the information she shared about her methods and objectives, training volunteers in proper collection techniques without revealing the full scope of her project. Her summer activities during the 4th year included a trip to the American Crayon Company factory in Sandusky, Ohio, where she was given a tour of the manufacturing facilities as part of an educational program for teachers. This visit provided first-hand knowledge of the chalk-making process, from the grinding of raw limestone through the mixing, pressing and drying stages that produced the finished sticks used in classrooms across the country. The factory tour revealed details about quality control procedures that helped explain some of the breakage patterns Miss Hartwell had observed in her collection. She learned that variations in the pressing pressure could create internal stress points that would become failure points under the normal stresses of classroom use. This information was carefully noted in her research files and used to refine her analysis of existing specimens in her collection. The 5th year brought the development of a comprehensive classification system that organized the collection according to multiple variables, including size, weight, color, breakage pattern and circumstances of failure. This system required the creation of detailed charts and graphs that Miss Hartwell prepared during evening hours in her boarding house room, working by lamplight to avoid disrupting other residents of the building. Her health remained stable throughout the collection period, though she began experiencing minor eye strain from the detailed documentation work that occupied much of her free time. She obtained reading glasses from the local optometrist and adjusted her work habits to include regular breaks that would prevent fatigue from affecting the accuracy of her observations and measurements. The collection had grown to include over 800 pieces by the end of the 5th year, representing fragments from nearly every stick of chalk that had been used in her classroom during that period. The storage requirements had expanded to fill most of the available space in her classroom, with containers stacked along the walls and in corners where they would not interfere with normal teaching activities. Her lesson planning during these years incorporated the knowledge she had gained about materials science through her chalk research, leading to innovative teaching approaches that used concrete examples from everyday classroom materials to illustrate abstract concepts in arithmetic, science, and geography. These teaching methods were observed and praised by visiting educators, though they never connected her pedagogical innovations to her collecting activities. The 6th year brought inquiries from education researchers who had heard about her teaching methods and wished to study her classroom techniques. Miss Hartwell accommodated these visits while carefully managing the information available to observers, ensuring that her collection remained unnoticed despite the increased scrutiny of her classroom environment. Her personal relationships during this period were limited by the time demands of her teaching and documentation activities, though she maintained friendships with several other teachers and continued her correspondence with family members in other parts of Iowa. These relationships provided emotional support and social contact that helped balance the solitary nature of her research work. The collection process had become so integrated into her daily routine that Miss Hartwell could perform the necessary documentation tasks without disrupting the flow of her teaching, retrieving and cataloging broken pieces during natural pauses in lessons or while students worked independently on assignments. This seamless integration of research and teaching demonstrated the high level of organization and time management skills that characterized all aspects of her professional life. Her financial records from this period show regular expenditures for storage materials, photographic supplies, and correspondence costs related to her research activities. These expenses were carefully budgeted from her teaching salary, with detailed accounting that tracked the costs associated with different aspects of the collection and documentation process. The 7th year brought recognition of her teaching excellence from the State Education Department, which selected her classroom as an example of effective elementary education methods. This recognition came with opportunities for professional advancement that she declined in order to continue her research in the familiar environment of her established classroom. Her documentation had evolved to include detailed environmental data about the conditions in her classroom, with regular measurements of temperature, humidity, and air circulation that might affect the durability of chalk and other classroom materials. This data was recorded using instruments that she purchased from scientific supply companies, adding precision to her observations about the relationship between environmental factors and material failures. The storage and organization of her growing collection required increasingly sophisticated methods, with Miss Hartwell developing a filing system that could locate specific specimens based on multiple search criteria. This system used cross-referenced index cards that allowed her to find pieces based on date, size, color, or any other characteristic that might be relevant to her analysis. Her reputation as an expert on classroom materials led to consultation requests from school districts in other parts of Iowa, seeking her advice about purchasing decisions and storage methods for educational supplies. These consultations provided additional income that helped support her research activities while spreading knowledge about proper materials management to other educational institutions. The final years of her teaching career saw the completion of her documentation system, with Miss Hartwell achieving her goal of creating a comprehensive record of chalk breakage patterns under normal classroom conditions. Her collection had grown to include over 1,500 pieces, each one carefully measured, weighed, photographed, and catalogued according to the systematic methods she had developed and refined over more than a decade of patient work. The mystery of her motivation remained unsolved even as her teaching career came to an end, with Miss Hartwell maintaining her silence about the purposes that had driven her systematic collection of broken chalk pieces. Her colleagues, students, and administrators continued to speculate about her unusual research project, but she never provided the explanation that would have satisfied their curiosity about one of the most methodical and unexplained educational research projects of the early 20th century.
How a housekeeper could tell time by the angle of the light in the grand household of the Pemberton estate on Beacon Hill in Boston. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley developed what would become the most precise system of timekeeping ever devised by domestic staff in 19th century America. Beginning in the spring of 1878, when she first assumed her position as head housekeeper for the distinguished family, she began to notice the subtle ways that sunlight moved through the mansion's 43 windows throughout the course of each day, observing how the angle and intensity of natural illumination changed with such regularity that she could determine the exact time without consulting any of the numerous clocks that adorned the residence' 15 rooms. The Pemberton mansion faced southeast, positioned on the slope of Beacon Hill to take advantage of both the morning sun and the commanding view of Boston Harbor that could be glimpsed between the neighboring brownstones. The architect who had designed the building in 1847 had given careful consideration to the placement of windows, creating openings that would maximize natural light while maintaining the formal proportions expected in a residence of such prominence. Each window had been fitted with glass panes imported from England, clear material that had been manufactured using techniques that produced fewer imperfections than American glass of the same period. Mrs. O'Malley's system began with her observations of the morning light as it entered through the tall windows of the breakfast room on the second floor, at precisely 15 minutes past 6 in the morning. During the months of April through September, the first rays of direct sunlight would strike the eastern wall of this room, creating a rectangular patch of illumination that measured approximately 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall. This patch would move across the wallpaper with such consistent timing that she could predict its location at any given moment throughout the morning hours. The wallpaper in the breakfast room had been hung in 1875, featuring a pattern of small roses connected by delicate green vines against a cream-colored background. The roses were arranged in regular intervals that Mrs. O'Malley used as reference points for measuring the progression of light across the wall. She discovered that the leading edge of the sunlit area would reach the third rose from the corner at 23 minutes past 6, advance to the seventh rose at 31 minutes past the hour, and illuminate the 11th rose at exactly 42 minutes past 6. Her initial observations were recorded in a small notebook that she kept in the pocket of her apron, using a pencil that she sharpened each morning with a small knife that had belonged to her father. The entries were brief notations that correlated specific positions of light patches with times indicated by the grandfather clock that stood in the front hallway, a timepiece that was regulated weekly by a clockmaker who arrived each Thursday afternoon to adjust its mechanism and wind its weights. The accuracy of the grandfather clock became crucial to Mrs. O'Malley's developing system, as any variation in its timekeeping would affect the reliability of her light-based observations. She began monitoring the clock's performance by comparing it with the church bells that rang each hour from the steeple of Park Street Church, whose carillon had been set according to astronomical observations made at Harvard College. The church bells provided a reliable reference that allowed her to detect minute variations in the grandfather clock's timing and adjust her calculations accordingly. During the summer months, she expanded her observations to include the drawing room on the first floor, where the late morning sun created patterns of light and shadow that moved across the Persian carpets with predictable precision. The carpets had been woven in Isfahan, featuring intricate geometric patterns in deep blues and rich burgundies, that provided excellent contrast for observing the subtle changes in illumination throughout the day. The shadows cast by the window mullions created thin dark lines that moved across the carpet's pattern like the hands of an enormous sundial. The drawing room's western exposure made it ideal for observing the afternoon progression of light, as the sun's rays would enter at increasingly steep angles as the day advanced toward evening. Mrs. O'Malley discovered that she could determine the time within 3 minutes of accuracy by noting which section of the carpet's central medallion was illuminated by direct sunlight. The medallion's 8-pointed star design provided distinct reference points that corresponded to specific times during the afternoon hours. Her documentation process became more sophisticated, as she recognized the seasonal variations that affected the angles and timing of light throughout the house. The sun's path across the sky changed gradually throughout the year, rising higher during summer months and lower during winter, requiring adjustments to her time calculations based on the date as well as the observed light patterns. She began maintaining separate charts for different seasons, with detailed notations about how the changing solar angle affected each of her reference points. The servants' quarters on the third floor provided additional opportunities for observation during the early morning hours, when Mrs. O'Malley would begin her daily rounds by checking on the sleeping arrangements and preparing for the household's awakening. The dormer windows in these rooms faced northeast, catching the first light of dawn during the summer months and providing reference points for the very earliest hours of the day. The attic spaces above the servants' quarters contained windows that faced in all 4 cardinal directions, creating opportunities for light observation throughout the entire day. Her system proved particularly valuable during the winter months, when shortened daylight hours made efficient time management crucial for completing all necessary household tasks. The low angle of winter sunlight created longer shadows and more dramatic light patterns that were actually easier to observe and measure than the more diffuse illumination of summer days. She developed special winter charts that took advantage of these enhanced shadow patterns, achieving even greater accuracy during the coldest months of the year. The library on the second floor became one of her most reliable observation points during the late morning and early afternoon hours. This room contained floor-to-ceiling windows on both the south and west walls, creating complex patterns of light that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. The mahogany bookshelves cast shadows that moved across the hardwood floor with clockwork precision, while the leather bindings of the books themselves reflected varying amounts of light depending on the angle of illumination. Mrs. O'Malley's charts included detailed drawings that showed the position of shadows cast by specific pieces of furniture at different times of day. The writing desk near the south window cast a shadow that she could use to determine time within 2 minutes of accuracy during the hours between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. The shadow's leading edge would align with specific floorboard joints at predictable intervals, creating a natural timeline that required no mechanical timepiece for reference. The dining room provided opportunities for evening observations, as the western windows allowed her to track the sun's descent toward the horizon during the final hours of daylight. The crystal chandelier that hung over the dining table created complex patterns of refracted light when the late afternoon sun struck its numerous prisms. These patterns changed gradually as the sun's angle decreased, creating a series of rainbow-colored patches that moved across the walls and ceiling in ways that Mrs. O'Malley learned to interpret with remarkable precision. Her understanding of seasonal variations led her to create a master calendar that showed how her reference points shifted throughout the year. The sun's position at any given time varied by several degrees between summer and winter, requiring different calculations for the same light patterns during different seasons. She developed formulas that allowed her to adjust her time readings based on the date, achieving consistent accuracy regardless of seasonal variations in solar angle. The practical applications of her system became apparent during the daily operations of the household, where precise timing was essential for coordinating meals, managing staff schedules, and ensuring that all tasks were completed according to the family's expectations. Mrs. O'Malley could determine when to begin preparations for meals, when to send servants on errands that would return them at specific times, and when to schedule cleaning activities that required optimal lighting conditions. Her reputation for punctuality and efficiency grew among the other servants, who began relying on her time announcements rather than consulting the various clocks scattered throughout the house. The kitchen staff learned to trust her signals for timing bread baking, roast cooking, and other culinary activities that required precise scheduling. The housemaids discovered that Mrs. O'Malley's time calls were more reliable than the clocks in their individual work areas, many of which had not been properly maintained and showed different times. The master bedroom on the second floor provided crucial reference points for the very early morning hours, when Mrs. O'Malley needed to begin her daily preparations before the family awakened. The eastern exposure of this room allowed her to observe the first light of dawn as it gradually brightened the sky, providing advance warning of sunrise and allowing her to gauge how much time remained before the household would need to begin its daily activities. She developed special techniques for observing light patterns during cloudy weather, when direct sunlight was not available for her usual measurements. The diffused light that penetrated overcast skies created subtler patterns that required more careful observation, but Mrs. O'Malley learned to read these gentler variations with almost the same accuracy she achieved during clear weather. She discovered that the relative brightness of different areas within rooms could indicate time even when distinct shadows were not visible. Her notebooks from this period show increasingly sophisticated diagrams that mapped light patterns throughout the house, with detailed measurements of shadow lengths, angles of illumination, and the timing of specific light phenomena. These drawings were executed with careful attention to scale and proportion, creating technical documents that could be used to train other observers in her methods. The precision of her documentation rivaled that of professional surveyors and architects who created similar drawings for construction purposes. The conservatory attached to the south side of the house provided unique opportunities for light observation, as its glass walls and ceiling created an environment where sunlight entered from multiple angles throughout the day. The tropical plants that Mrs. Pemberton cultivated in this space cast shadows that changed constantly as the sun moved across the sky, creating a natural clock that Mrs. O'Malley learned to read with extraordinary precision. The palm fronds and flowering vines created shadow patterns that served as minute hands on this living timepiece. Her system proved invaluable during formal entertaining, when precise timing was crucial for coordinating multiple courses, managing service staff, and ensuring that events proceeded according to the elaborate schedules that characterized upper-class social functions. Mrs. O'Malley could orchestrate dinner parties and receptions with military precision, knowing exactly when each course should be served, when additional staff should be summoned, and when carriages should be called for departing guests. The seasonal changes in her reference points required constant adjustment and refinement of her calculations, as the sun's path across the sky shifted gradually throughout the year. She developed correction factors that allowed her to compensate for these changes, maintaining accuracy within a few minutes throughout all seasons. Her understanding of astronomical principles, learned through careful observation, rather than formal education, rivaled that of university-trained astronomers who studied similar solar movements for scientific purposes. The basement areas of the house provided reference points for times when upper floors were too bright for subtle light observations, particularly during the middle hours of summer days when intense sunlight could wash out the gentle patterns that Mrs. O'Malley relied upon for precise timekeeping. The small windows at ground level created thin beams of light that moved across stone floors and brick walls with measurable precision, allowing her to maintain her timekeeping accuracy even in areas where most people would notice no light patterns at all. Her correspondence with her sister in County Cork included references to her unusual timekeeping abilities, though she described them as simply part of her household management skills rather than acknowledging the sophisticated system she had developed. These letters provide insight into her thinking about domestic efficiency and the importance of precise timing in managing a large household, though they do not reveal the full extent of her light-based time measurement techniques. The stairwells throughout the house created vertical channels where light behaved in particularly predictable ways, with illumination from landing windows creating patterns that moved up and down the walls as the sun's angle changed throughout the day. Mrs. O'Malley learned to use these vertical light movements as indicators of time, noting how specific steps would be illuminated or shadowed at particular hours. The main staircase with its elegant banister and carved newel posts became a three-dimensional sundial that she could read while moving between floors. Her training of assistant housekeepers included basic instruction in light observation, though she reserved the most sophisticated techniques for her own use. Junior staff members learned to recognize major time markers that would help them coordinate their work with the household schedule, but Mrs. O'Malley maintained the detailed knowledge that allowed for minute-by-minute timekeeping accuracy. This system ensured that household operations continued smoothly while preserving her special expertise. The laundry areas in the basement and ground floor service areas provided additional reference points for times when weather conditions made outdoor light observations difficult. Even during the gloomiest winter days, sufficient light entered through service windows to create measurable patterns that Mrs. O'Malley could interpret for timekeeping purposes. The whitewashed walls of these work areas reflected available light effectively, creating contrast that made subtle light variations visible even under challenging conditions. Her understanding of light behavior led to innovations in household efficiency that went beyond simple timekeeping, as she learned to schedule different types of work according to optimal lighting conditions. Tasks that required detailed attention were planned for times when natural light provided the best illumination, while routine cleaning that required less visual precision could be scheduled during periods of lower light quality. This optimization of work scheduling according to natural light patterns increased the overall efficiency of household operations. The guest bedrooms on the third floor provided reference points that were particularly useful during house parties and extended visits, when the normal household routine was disrupted by the presence of visitors. Mrs. O'Malley could coordinate guest services, meal timing, and staff assignments by consulting the light patterns in these rooms, maintaining proper hospitality standards even when the usual schedules were altered by social obligations. Her reputation among other domestic staff in neighboring households grew as word spread about her remarkable timekeeping abilities, though few understood the systematic nature of her light observation methods. Other housekeepers would consult her about timing questions when their own timepieces disagreed or malfunctioned, trusting her light-based assessments over mechanical clocks that might have gained or lost time since their last regulation. The seasonal celebrations and holiday preparations that were traditional in the Pemberton household required particularly precise timing coordination, as multiple courses, entertainment programs, and guest activities needed to be orchestrated simultaneously. Mrs. O'Malley's light-based timekeeping system allowed her to manage these complex events without the constant clock watching that would have been necessary using conventional timepieces scattered throughout the house. Her documentation expanded to include weather-related variations in light quality and intensity, as she recognized that atmospheric conditions could affect the accuracy of her observations. Fog, rain, snow, and cloud cover all created different challenges for light-based timekeeping, requiring special techniques and alternative reference points to maintain accuracy during adverse weather conditions. She developed backup systems that used reflected light, artificial illumination, and even sound cues to supplement her visual observations when necessary. The morning room, used by the family for informal meals and correspondence, provided excellent reference points for mid-morning timekeeping due to its eastern exposure and relatively simple furniture arrangement. The writing desk positioned near the window cast a shadow that moved across the carpet with such regularity that Mrs. O'Malley could determine the time within minutes by noting the shadow's position relative to the carpet's floral border pattern. Her system proved particularly valuable during the winter months when mechanical clocks were more likely to malfunction due to temperature variations and irregular winding schedules. The reliability of solar-based timekeeping provided a consistent reference that remained accurate regardless of mechanical problems that might affect the various timepieces throughout the house. This reliability became crucial during extended periods when the regular clockmaker could not visit due to weather conditions.
The servant call system that connected different floors of the house operated more efficiently under Mrs. O'Malley's time management, as she could coordinate requests and responses according to precise schedules that took into account travel time between floors and the duration of various household tasks. Her light-based timekeeping allowed her to predict when servants would be available for new assignments and when specific tasks would be completed. Her personal correspondence during this period reveals a woman who took pride in the efficiency and precision of her household management, while remaining modest about the sophisticated system she had developed. Letters to family members in Ireland describe her work in general terms, focusing on the satisfaction she found in managing a well-ordered household rather than detailing the innovative timekeeping methods that made such efficiency possible. The music room on the first floor provided unique acoustic reference points that supplemented her visual light observations, as the piano and other instruments responded to temperature and humidity changes that correlated with the time of day. Mrs. O'Malley learned to recognize the subtle sounds that indicated these environmental changes, adding auditory cues to her timekeeping arsenal and improving her accuracy during periods when light observations were difficult. Her training in light observation techniques became part of the informal education system that existed among domestic staff, with experienced servants passing knowledge to newcomers through demonstration and practice rather than formal instruction. Mrs. O'Malley's methods were gradually adopted by other staff members who recognized their practical value, though none achieved her level of precision and systematic understanding. The pantry and storage areas throughout the house provided reference points that were particularly useful during food preparation and meal service coordination, when precise timing was essential for ensuring that multiple dishes would be ready simultaneously. The small windows in these work areas created light patterns that Mrs. O'Malley could read while supervising cooking activities, allowing her to coordinate complex meal preparations without leaving her post to consult distant timepieces. Her understanding of light behavior extended to artificial illumination, as she learned to predict how gas lamps and candles would supplement natural light during evening hours and winter months when daylight was insufficient for all necessary tasks. This knowledge allowed her to plan lighting requirements and fuel consumption according to predictable patterns, contributing to the overall efficiency of household operations. The billiard room in the basement provided reference points during evening entertainment periods, when the family and guests would gather for games and conversation after dinner. The small windows at ground level allowed Mrs. O'Malley to track the progression of evening hours and coordinate service requirements for these social activities, ensuring that refreshments and assistance were available precisely when needed. Her system reached its highest level of sophistication during the final years of her service with the Pemberton family, when decades of observation and refinement had created a timekeeping method that rivaled the accuracy of the finest mechanical chronometers available at the time. Her ability to determine time within minutes using only the angle and intensity of natural light represented a remarkable achievement in practical astronomy and domestic efficiency, though she never sought recognition for this extraordinary skill beyond the satisfaction of managing her household responsibilities with unprecedented precision.
Why they folded letters like origami in 1775. The practice of letter folding in the 18th century represented far more than simple correspondence preparation, embodying instead a complex system of communication that merged practical necessity with elaborate social protocol. In the year 1775, when paper remained precious and postal systems unreliable, the art of transforming a single sheet of writing paper into its own secure envelope had evolved into a sophisticated craft that required both technical precision and social awareness. The foundation of proper letter folding began with the paper itself, typically manufactured from linen rags that had been carefully sorted, cleaned, and processed through water-powered mills scattered throughout the American colonies and European countryside. These sheets, measuring approximately 15 inches by 12 inches, when fully opened, bore the subtle texture of their origins, with watermarks pressed into the pulp during formation that identified both maker and quality grade. The weight of such paper, substantial enough to withstand multiple foldings, without tearing along the creases, provided the necessary durability for correspondence that might travel hundreds of miles through uncertain conditions. Before any folding commenced, The writer would complete their message using quill pens cut from goose or swan feathers, with the nib carefully shaped to control the flow of iron gall ink across the paper's surface. The ink itself, prepared from oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic, required time to properly dry and set into the paper fibers, creating permanent marks that would resist both moisture and handling during transport. Writers learned to gauge the precise moment when the ink had sufficiently dried to allow folding without smearing, a skill developed through years of correspondence practice. The initial fold of a completed letter followed established conventions that varied subtly between regions and social classes, yet maintained consistent underlying principles throughout the Atlantic world. The most common approach began with folding the bottom third of the sheet upward, creating a horizontal crease approximately 5 inches from the paper's lower edge. This fold enclosed the main body of text while leaving the upper portion available for addressing information and postal markings. The precision of this first fold proved crucial, as uneven creases would create gaps that might allow the letter's contents to become visible during handling. Following the primary horizontal fold, the letter writer would typically execute a series of vertical folds that transformed the rectangular shape into a more compact and secure packet. The right edge of the paper would be folded inward by approximately 2 inches, followed by the left edge folded to overlap slightly with the first vertical crease. These overlapping folds created a natural tension that helped maintain the letter's closed position without requiring excessive sealing wax, a consideration of both economy and practicality in an era when quality sealing wax commanded significant expense. The complexity of folding techniques increased considerably for correspondence requiring enhanced security or formal presentation. Letters containing sensitive information, financial details, or official communications often employed additional folding sequences that created multiple layers of protection against unauthorized examination. One such method involved creating a series of accordion-style folds that compressed the letter into a narrow strip, which was then folded again perpendicular to the initial creases, resulting in a compact square packet that thoroughly concealed all written content. Regional variations in folding practices reflected both local postal customs and cultural preferences that had developed over generations of correspondence exchange. In the Northern American colonies, writers frequently employed a folding technique that created a distinctive triangular flap, formed by bringing the upper corners of the paper together at a central point before executing the final sealing fold. This method, inherited from Dutch and English postal traditions, provided exceptional security while creating an aesthetically pleasing exterior that demonstrated the sender's attention to proper form. Southern colonial correspondence often featured more elaborate folding patterns that incorporated elements borrowed from French court customs, reflecting the cultural influences that shaped social practices throughout the region. These techniques involved creating multiple interlocking folds that formed geometric patterns on the letter's exterior, with each crease carefully aligned to maintain symmetry and visual appeal. The execution of such complex folding required considerable skill and patience, marking the sender as someone well versed in the refined arts of genteel correspondence. The tools employed in letter folding, while simple in appearance, demanded careful selection and maintenance to achieve consistently professional results. Bone folders, carved from cattle or sheep bones and polished to a smooth finish, provided the necessary pressure to create sharp, lasting creases without tearing the paper fibers. These implements, typically measuring 4 to 6 inches in length with one pointed end and one rounded end, allowed writers to execute both broad sweeping folds and precise corner alignments with equal facility. Rulers made from hardwood or occasionally ivory served to measure fold distances and ensure parallel creases throughout complex folding sequences. The most dedicated correspondents maintained sets of rulers in various lengths, allowing for precise measurement regardless of paper size or folding pattern complexity. These measuring tools, often passed down through families or professional networks, bore the accumulated marks and stains of decades of correspondence preparation, becoming valued instruments in the careful craft of letter presentation. The preparation of sealing wax represented another crucial element in the letter folding process, requiring both technical knowledge and aesthetic sensibility to achieve optimal results. Quality sealing wax, composed primarily of beeswax, pine resin, and mineral pigments, needed to be heated to precisely the correct temperature to flow smoothly, while maintaining sufficient body to create secure seals. Writers typically used small copper ladles or dedicated wax melting spoons, heated over candle flames or small spirit lamps, to achieve the necessary consistency for effective sealing. The selection of sealing wax colors carried significant social and practical implications that extended beyond mere aesthetic preference. Red wax, the most common choice for general correspondence, conveyed appropriate formality, while providing reliable adhesion across a wide range of paper types and environmental conditions. Black wax served for mourning correspondence or communications of grave import, while green wax often indicated business or commercial communications. The more affluent might employ gold or silver wax for especially important occasions, though such luxury came at considerable expense and required particular skill in application. Creating effective wax seals demanded precise timing and steady hand coordination to achieve both security and visual appeal. The folded letter would be positioned with its final flap properly aligned, and a small pool of molten wax applied to the center of the overlapping paper edges. The seal itself, typically carved from metal, stone, or occasionally wood, would then be pressed firmly into the warm wax and held steady until the material cooled sufficiently to maintain the impression. The resulting seal created both a tamper-evident closure and an identifying mark that authenticated the sender's identity. Personal seals carried deep significance within 18th century correspondence culture, serving as both practical authentication devices and symbols of social status and family heritage. Gentlemen typically possessed signet rings bearing their family arms or personal devices, while ladies often maintained separate seals for their correspondence, sometimes featuring initials, flowers, or other decorative motifs appropriate to their station. The designs carved into these seals represented permanent investments in one's correspondence capabilities, as replacing a seal required considerable expense and careful attention to maintaining consistent authentication across one's ongoing correspondence network. The addressing of folded letters followed established conventions that balanced practical postal requirements with social protocols regarding appropriate forms of address and recognition. The exterior surface of the folded letter, typically the reverse side of the original sheet, provided space for the recipient's name, location, and any special handling instructions required for successful delivery. Writers learned to position this addressing information in locations that would remain visible and legible, despite the handling and marking that letters received during transport through postal systems. Postal markings applied by colonial postmasters and their assistants added additional layers of information to folded letters, creating historical records of the correspondence's journey through official delivery systems. These markings, typically applied using hand-carved wooden stamps or metal devices, indicated posting dates, originating locations, and postage calculations based on distance and paper weight. The systematic application of such markings required postmasters to maintain detailed knowledge of postal rates, delivery routes, and accounting procedures that governed colonial correspondence systems. The calculation of postage fees involved complex considerations of distance, paper weight, and special handling requirements that varied significantly between different postal jurisdictions and delivery routes. Letters traveling short distances within individual colonies faced different rate structures than correspondence crossing colonial boundaries or traveling to European destinations. Postmasters maintained detailed charts and calculation aids to ensure accurate fee assessment, as errors in postage calculation could result in delayed delivery or financial disputes between senders and recipients. Quality control in letter folding became increasingly important as postal systems expanded and correspondence volumes grew throughout the colonial period. Improperly folded letters might arrive with damaged seals, torn paper, or compromised contents, reflecting poorly on both sender and postal system reliability. Experienced correspondents developed systematic approaches to folding verification, checking each crease, seal, and addressing element before entrusting letters to postal authorities. The seasonal variations in letter folding practices reflected both practical considerations and social customs that shaped correspondence rhythms throughout the year. Winter months, when indoor activities predominated and social visiting decreased, saw increased correspondence volumes that required efficient folding techniques capable of handling larger quantities of letters. Summer correspondence often featured more elaborate folding and sealing practices, as increased leisure time allowed for greater attention to aesthetic details and social refinements. Weather conditions significantly influence both folding techniques and material selection for correspondence preparation. Humid summer weather could cause paper to become limp and difficult to fold crisply, while winter's dry air might make paper brittle and prone to cracking along fold lines. Experienced letter writers adjusted their techniques accordingly, sometimes using slightly dampened fingers to improve paper flexibility, or allowing extra drying time for ink and sealing wax during periods of high humidity. The preservation of folded letters presented ongoing challenges for both senders and recipients who wished to maintain correspondence records for future reference. Frequent opening and refolding of letters inevitably weakened paper along crease lines, while extended storage could result in permanent set marks that made flat reading difficult. Some recipients developed systems for careful letter opening that minimized damage to original folding patterns, allowing for better preservation of both content and form. Storage systems for completed folded letters required careful consideration of space efficiency, organization, and protection from environmental damage. Writers who maintained extensive correspondence often developed filing systems that grouped letters by recipient, date, or subject matter, using wooden boxes, leather portfolios, or specially designed escritoires with multiple compartments. The organization of such storage systems reflected both practical needs for letter retrieval and social aspirations regarding the proper maintenance of genteel correspondence practices. Teaching letter folding techniques typically occurred within family settings, where older family members passed skills to younger generations through patient demonstration and guided practice. The learning process involved mastering not only the physical techniques of paper manipulation, but also the social knowledge of appropriate folding methods for different types of correspondence and recipients. Young people learned to distinguish between folding approaches suitable for family letters, business communications, and formal social correspondence. The economic aspects of letter folding extended beyond simple material costs to encompass broader considerations of time investment, skill development, and social positioning within correspondence networks. Individuals who achieved recognized proficiency in letter folding often found themselves serving as advisors or assistants to others less skilled in these arts, creating informal networks of correspondence expertise that supported community communication needs. The investment of time required to master complex folding techniques represented a form of cultural capital that enhanced one's social standing and communication effectiveness. Regional supply chains for correspondence materials created local variations in paper quality, ink composition, and sealing wax availability that influenced folding practices throughout different areas of colonial America. Communities with access to established printing and paper-making operations enjoyed more consistent material quality, while frontier areas might rely on imported supplies of variable quality that required adaptive folding techniques. These material constraints shaped the development of local folding traditions that balanced ideal practices with available resources. The apprenticeship systems that governed many colonial trades included letter folding instruction as part of broader literacy and communication training for young workers. Clerks, merchants, and artisans learned systematic approaches to correspondence handling that emphasized efficiency, consistency, and professional presentation. These vocational applications of letter folding skills created standardized practices within specific trades and industries, contributing to the development of recognizable folding styles associated with particular types of business correspondence. Quality assessment of folded letters involved multiple criteria that reflected both functional and aesthetic considerations important to 18th century correspondence culture. Effective folding created secure closures that protected letter contents while presenting neat professional appearances that honored both sender and recipient. The alignment of creases, symmetry of folds, and placement of seals all contributed to overall assessments of correspondence quality that influenced social perceptions of the correspondence involved. The timing of letter folding within broader correspondence routines required coordination with ink drying, wax heating, and postal delivery schedules that governed communication rhythms in colonial communities. Writers learned to sequence their correspondence activities efficiently, preparing multiple letters simultaneously when possible while ensuring adequate attention to folding quality for each individual communication.
This coordination of correspondence tasks represented a form of domestic time management that balanced communication needs with other household and professional responsibilities. Advanced folding techniques developed by particularly skilled correspondents incorporated elements of geometric precision and artistic sensibility that elevated letter folding from mere utility to expressions of personal refinement and cultural sophistication. These advanced methods might involve creating intricate fold patterns that form decorative shapes or symbolic designs visible on the letter's exterior, demonstrating the sender's mastery of correspondence arts while honoring the recipient with exceptional attention to presentation details. The documentation of folding techniques through correspondence manuals and instructional texts reflected growing recognition of letter folding as a legitimate component of genteel education and social preparation. These instructional materials provided systematic approaches to fold sequences, seal placement, and addressing conventions that supported the standardization of correspondence practices across different social and geographic contexts. The publication and circulation of such guidance materials contributed to the development of shared correspondence culture throughout the Atlantic world. Professional correspondence services that emerged in larger colonial towns sometimes included letter folding among their offered capabilities, serving clients who lacked either the time or skill to properly prepare their own correspondence. These services employed experienced clerks who maintained current knowledge of folding conventions and postal requirements, ensuring that client correspondence met appropriate standards for successful delivery and social acceptance. The availability of such services reflected both growing correspondence volumes and increasing recognition of folding complexity as a specialized skill requiring dedicated attention and expertise.
How they ironed lace without burning it. The preservation and maintenance of delicate lace in the 18th and 19th centuries required a specialized body of knowledge that encompassed not merely technique, but an intimate understanding of fiber behavior, heat distribution, and the subtle variations in thread tension that distinguished fine needlework from coarser textiles. The process of pressing lace without causing irreparable damage demanded equipment specifically designed for such delicate work, along with years of experience in reading the subtle signs that indicated when heat application had reached its optimal point. The foundation of successful lace ironing began with the preparation of specialized pressing tools that differed substantially from the heavy flat irons used for household linens and everyday garments. Lace irons, typically weighing no more than 2 or 3 pounds, were crafted with smooth, highly polished surfaces that eliminated any possibility of snagging the delicate mesh structures that characterized fine lacework. These implements were manufactured by skilled metal workers who understood the precise balance between heat retention and weight distribution necessary for effective lace pressing. The construction of quality lace irons involved careful attention to both metallurgical composition and surface finishing that distinguished them from common pressing tools. The iron body was typically cast from a fine-grained metal alloy that provided even heat distribution while maintaining relatively light weight, with the pressing surface ground and polished to mirror smoothness. Any irregularities in the iron surface, no matter how minute, risked catching individual lace threads during pressing, potentially destroying hours or even days of intricate needlework in a single careless moment. Temperature control represented perhaps the most critical aspect of lace ironing, requiring laundresses and ladies' maids to develop highly refined sensitivities to heat levels that remained below the threshold of fiber damage. Unlike the high temperatures suitable for pressing cotton or linen fabrics, lace pressing demanded temperatures that barely exceeded body heat, achieved through careful heating over controlled flame sources and constant monitoring of the iron's thermal state. The traditional method of testing iron temperature by holding it close to one's cheek provided experienced practitioners with surprisingly accurate assessments of readiness for lace application. The heating of lace irons typically occurred over specially designed braziers or small charcoal fires that provided steady controllable heat sources without the intense temperatures generated by blacksmith forges or cooking fires. These heating arrangements often incorporated adjustable grates or iron supports that allowed precise control of the distance between heat source and iron, enabling gradual temperature increases that prevented the rapid heating that might cause thermal shock to delicate lace fibers. Experienced lace pressers maintained multiple irons of varying sizes, rotating them through heating cycles to ensure consistent temperature availability throughout extended pressing sessions. Preparation of the lace itself before pressing required systematic examination and cleaning procedures that addressed both visible soiling and the accumulated handling residues that could cause permanent staining when subjected to heat application. Each piece of lace underwent careful inspection under good natural light, with particular attention paid to areas where skin oils, cosmetic powders or environmental dust might have accumulated during wear or storage. These contaminants, invisible under normal circumstances, could become permanently bonded to lace fibers when exposed to pressing temperatures. The cleaning of lace prior to pressing involved gentle washing techniques that preserved the structural integrity of complex thread arrangements, while removing accumulated soiling that might cause discoloration during heat application. Soft rainwater or distilled water served as the preferred cleaning medium, as the mineral content of well water or spring water could leave deposits that would become visible brown or yellow stains when heated during pressing. The washing process itself employed minimal agitation, with the lace typically laid flat in shallow basins and gently manipulated by hand to encourage soil release without stressing the delicate thread connections. Drying of freshly washed lace demanded equal care and attention to prevent the formation of permanent wrinkles or distortions that would prove difficult or impossible to correct during subsequent pressing operations. The preferred drying method involved laying the damp lace between layers of clean absorbent linen cloth, with the entire assembly placed on flat surfaces away from direct sunlight or artificial heat sources that might cause rapid moisture loss and consequent thread shrinkage. This controlled drying process could require several hours or even overnight completion, depending on the thickness and complexity of the particular lace pattern. The actual pressing process began with the preparation of pressing surfaces that provided both adequate support for the delicate lacework and protection from potential heat damage. Professional laundresses typically employed pressing boards covered with multiple layers of fine woolen cloth, creating surfaces that yielded slightly under pressure while maintaining smooth, even support for the entire lace piece. These pressing cloths required regular cleaning and replacement, as any accumulated residues or worn areas could transfer marks to the delicate lace during pressing operations. Initial positioning of lace on the pressing surface demanded careful attention to the natural lay of the fabric and the alignment of pattern elements that would be emphasized or flattened during the pressing process. Complex lace patterns incorporated raised elements designed to create dimensional effects, and successful pressing required understanding which areas should receive direct iron contact and which should be pressed only indirectly through protective covering cloths. This selective pressing technique preserved the intended three-dimensional characteristics that distinguished fine lace from flat, purely decorative needlework. The application of protective pressing cloths over positioned lace served multiple functions beyond simple heat protection, providing pressure distribution that prevented individual lace elements from receiving excessive force while allowing the gentle heat application necessary for effective pressing. These protective cloths, typically fine linen or cotton lawn, were selected for their ability to transmit heat evenly while providing sufficient barrier protection to prevent direct iron contact with delicate lace threads. The thickness and weave characteristics of pressing cloths required careful matching to specific lace types and pressing requirements. Temperature testing of heated irons immediately before lace application involved time-tested methods that provided reliable indications of appropriate heat levels without risking damage to valuable lacework. The traditional technique of sprinkling small drops of water onto the iron surface allowed experienced pressers to judge temperature by observing water behavior, with gentle sizzling indicating appropriate heat levels while violent boiling suggested excessive temperatures requiring cooling periods before safe application to delicate materials. The actual pressing motion employed for lacework differed substantially from the firm, sliding movements appropriate for household linens, instead utilizing gentle lifting and placing motions that applied heat and pressure without lateral stress on delicate thread structures. Each iron placement covered only small areas of the lace piece, with overlapping applications ensuring complete coverage while maintaining precise control over heat application duration. This methodical approach required considerable time and patience but provided the careful attention necessary for successful lace pressing without damage. Timing of heat application represented another critical variable in successful lace pressing, with optimal results achieved through brief contact periods that transmitted sufficient heat for effective pressing without prolonged exposure that might weaken fiber structures or cause discoloration. Experienced pressers developed internal timing mechanisms that regulated contact duration based on visual assessment of lace response to heat application, removing ions at the first indication of adequate pressing while avoiding the extended contact that risked heat damage. The cooling process following heat application required equal attention to prevent rapid temperature changes that might cause thread shrinkage or distortion in the freshly pressed lace. Pressed sections were typically covered with clean pressing cloths and allowed to cool gradually while remaining flat on the pressing surface, preventing the formation of new wrinkles or distortions that could undo the benefits of careful pressing work. This cooling period also allowed final assessment of pressing results before proceeding to adjacent sections of the lace piece. Complex lace patterns incorporating multiple thread types or varying densities required adaptive pressing techniques that accommodated different heat requirements within single pieces of needlework. Silk threads used for highlighting or contrast elements demanded lower pressing temperatures than cotton or linen-based threads, requiring careful temperature adjustment or selective application techniques that provided appropriate treatment for each thread type. This selective approach sometimes involved multiple pressing sessions with different temperature settings to achieve optimal results across all elements of complex lace designs. The pressing of three-dimensional lace elements such as raised flowers, leaves, or geometric motifs demanded specialized techniques that preserved intended dimensional characteristics while achieving overall fabric smoothness. These elements typically received indirect pressing through multiple layers of protective cloth, with heat application sufficient to eliminate wrinkles in supporting fabric areas while avoiding flattening that would destroy the dimensional effects that constituted primary design features of quality lacework. Seasonal considerations affected lace pressing procedures due to variations in ambient humidity and temperature that influenced both lace behavior and iron heating characteristics. Summer pressing operations contended with high humidity levels that slowed drying processes and affected the behavior of natural fiber laces, while winter conditions with low humidity and dry air required adjustments in moisture content and heat application timing to prevent excessive brittleness in processed lace pieces. Storage of pressed lace required immediate attention to prevent the formation of new wrinkles or creases that would necessitate repetition of the time-consuming pressing process. Freshly pressed lace pieces were typically laid flat between layers of acid-free tissue paper or fine linen cloth, with storage containers designed to accommodate full extension of even large lace items without folding or compression that might create permanent marks. These storage systems often incorporated aromatic herbs or other natural preservatives that deterred insect damage while maintaining pleasant fragrance. Quality assessment of pressed lace involved systematic examination under good lighting conditions to verify complete wrinkle removal, consistent surface texture, and preservation of intended design characteristics throughout the piece. Areas requiring additional attention received supplementary pressing with adjusted temperature or technique modifications, while sections showing any signs of heat damage or distortion were documented for future reference and possible repair consideration. This quality control process ensured that pressed lace met the high standards expected for fine needlework presentation and use. The maintenance of pressing equipment required regular attention to prevent the accumulation of residues or surface irregularities that might transfer to delicate lace during subsequent pressing operations. Iron surfaces underwent periodic cleaning with fine abrasives to remove any buildup of starch, sizing, or other materials that might have accumulated during pressing activities, while pressing cloths received frequent washing and inspection to ensure continued suitability for delicate work applications. Professional training in lace pressing techniques typically occurred through apprenticeship arrangements that combined theoretical instruction with extensive practical experience under expert supervision.
Students learn to recognize different lace types and their specific pressing requirements, develop sensitivity to appropriate temperature levels and timing, and practice the controlled movements necessary for effective pressing without damage. This training process often required months or years to achieve proficiency levels suitable for handling valuable or irreplaceable lace items. The economic aspects of lace pressing services reflected both the time investment required for careful work and the specialized knowledge necessary for successful results without damage to valuable needlework. Professional pressing services commanded premium fees that recognized both the skill required and the financial risk assumed when handling expensive lace items, with pricing structures that reflected lace complexity, size, and condition factors that influenced pressing difficulty and time requirements. Regional variations in lace pressing techniques developed in response to local climate conditions, available equipment, and cultural preferences regarding lace presentation and maintenance. Areas with high humidity developed specialized drying and moisture control techniques, while regions with limited fuel supplies created efficient heating methods that minimized resource consumption while maintaining effective pressing capabilities. These regional adaptations contributed to diverse traditions of lace care that reflected both practical constraints and aesthetic preferences. The documentation of lace pressing procedures through household management guides and professional training materials provided systematic approaches to technique development and quality assurance that supported consistent results across different practitioners and locations. These instructional resources emphasized both technical procedures and the development of sensory skills necessary for temperature assessment, timing control, and quality evaluation that distinguished successful lace pressing from mere routine fabric care. Seasonal scheduling of lace pressing activities often concentrated major pressing campaigns during periods when weather conditions favored both effective pressing and subsequent storage, with spring and autumn traditionally preferred for comprehensive lace maintenance programs. These seasonal approaches allowed household staff to coordinate lace pressing with broader textile care activities while taking advantage of moderate temperatures and humidity levels that facilitated both pressing operations and effective storage of processed items. The preservation of antique lace through careful pressing techniques represented an important aspect of textile conservation that balanced immediate presentation needs with long-term preservation goals that recognized lace as valuable cultural artifacts worthy of careful stewardship. Conservation-oriented pressing approaches emphasized minimal intervention techniques that achieved necessary presentation standards while avoiding procedures that might compromise the structural integrity or historical authenticity of aged needlework pieces. Advanced pressing techniques developed by master practitioners incorporated subtle variations in pressure application, heat distribution, and timing sequences that achieved superior results while maintaining safety margins that protected valuable lace from processing damage. These advanced methods often involved complex sequences of partial pressing, cooling, repositioning, and repeated application that required extensive experience and judgment to execute successfully, representing the highest levels of achievement in the specialized craft of lace maintenance and presentation.